When walking in the mall, have you ever been approached by an aggressive salesperson screaming, "Excuse me, could I ask you a question?" And you reply, "Sure," since you don't want to come off as rude. And they might ask, "Are you looking for a conditioner to volumize your dull and flat hair? Then I've got the product for you." Or how about when a telemarketer calls your house and asking, "Hello, would you like to make a $100 donation to our charity today?" But after you refuse, they would ask, "Oh, well, that's all right. You can donate $10 instead," which sounds more reasonable, so you agree. If you've experienced any of these situations, then you have fallen into the foot in the door and the door in the face traps. These two techniques are used to induce compliance, which is changes in behavior due to a direct request. The focus of this video will be to explain in detail the foot in the door and the door in the face techniques, and how they cause compliance. We will further explain key classical studies performed by Freedman and Fraser, and studies done by Cialdini and colleagues. We will then explain using research which technique is best at generating compliance. It is important for everyone to know how these techniques work, because people will always try to get others to do things for them. When we are aware of how they are doing it, it can allow us to take a step back and think before making a decision. By the end of this video, we hope that you will gain a better understanding of the foot in the door and the door in the face techniques, and what underlying factors influence how they affect us, and then be able to catch on when being faced with these techniques. The foot in the door is a two-step compliance technique that involves asking a person for a small request, and once they agreed, ask them for a larger request. People are more likely to agree to the larger request once they've agreed to the smaller one. This technique relies on a person's desire for consistency. When we perform a behavior, we're likely to engage into a similar behavior to be consistent. This is why we agree to the second larger request. Another reason that we comply is because of our self-perception and how we interpret our attitudes from our behaviors. People who agree to the initial request would see it as reflective of their self-perception and attitudes, and to be consistent, they're more likely to agree to the second request. They end up creating a new self-image of being the type of person who complies to these kinds of requests. These techniques are used to target consumers in retail and marketing. When they try to sell you a cheap product, but then eventually persuade you to buy a more expensive product. The foot in the door technique can also be used by charitable organizations. By requesting small donations, they eventually build up to larger donations. This technique can also be used by public awareness campaigns. For example, one study done by Carducci and colleagues found that those who agreed to do questionnaires about organ donations were more willing to become organ donors in the future. Freedman and Fraser in 1966 demonstrated the effects of this technique in their two-part experiment. In the first experiment, they recruited 156 randomly selected women who were placed into 4 groups, where the first 3 groups were contacted twice, while the 4th group was only contacted once. The first 3 groups were asked to do a survey about the type of household products they used. Afterwards, they were contacted 3 days later to see if they would allow one of the representatives to go to their house to catalog their products. The results showed that 52.8% of those who did the survey later agreed to allow a representative to come to their house. However, 22% of those who were only contacted once allowed a representative to come to their house. This experiment demonstrates that if a person agrees to a small request, they are likely to agree to a larger request asked by the same person. The second experiment involved 112 women and men, in which 7 men were at home at the time. They were divided into similar groups as the first experiment. They were asked if they would put a small sign on their yard or fill out a survey about safe driving or keeping California clean. The second request involved being asked by a different person if they would put a larger, unattractive billboard about either safe driving or keeping California clean in their yard. The results showed that 55% of those who agreed to put the small sign also agreed to put the large billboard. However, 20% of those who were only asked to put out the billboard agreed. This demonstrates that the foot in the door technique remains effective even if the second request is asked by a different person and is not related to the initial request. One of the merits of this study is that they randomly selected their participants. This allows for an increase in internal validity, which is the degree to which the results are due to effects of the independent variable on the dependent variable. Also, both experiments were set up in a way that the second experiment would make up for a problem in the first experiment. According to Freedman and Fraser, a problem with the first experiment was that the experimenter was not blind to the condition of the subjects during the second request. However, in the second experiment, they used different experimenters for both requests. and the experimenters were blind to the conditions the subjects were in. This limits the influence of experimenter bias on the results. A limitation of this study is a small sample in both experiments. This causes a decrease in the external validity, which is the ability to generalize the result of the study to the rest of the population. Another limitation that was acknowledged by the researchers was that there could have been other confounding variables that could have influenced the results that were not measured. To summarize, both studies show that people are more likely to comply to a larger request only after they've agreed to the initial smaller request. But what if the order of the requests were reversed? Well, that's the focus of the door-in-the-face technique. The door-in-the-face is another two-step compliance technique in which a person is asked an unreasonably large request, but then after asks a smaller, more reasonable request. This causes the individual to be more likely to agree to the small request. This technique relies on reciprocity concession, which is, according to Sanderson and Sapdar, when one tries to reciprocate the behaviors of others. In the case of the door-in-the-face technique, one feels compelled to agree to the smaller request because the requester was willing to compromise from their initial larger request. It's also believed that the person feels guilty when they reject the first offer, so to feel less guilty, they comply with the second request. Another possible explanation is the perceptual contrast. Since the second request is more reasonable in contrast to the larger request, the person would be more likely to agree to it. Finally, self-perception also plays a role, in that the person accepts the second request to show positive qualities of themselves, like when someone who is kind enough to be open to compromise. Studies done by Patch found that the door-in-the-face technique works best when trying to get people to do pro-social behaviors, like charity, since they feel more guilty when they reject the initial request. However, it's not as effective in retail and trade. Cialdini and colleagues demonstrate the effects of this technique in their three-part experiment. In the first experiment, there were 3 groups. In the first group, they asked university students if they wanted to become volunteer counselors for juvenile delinquents for 2 hours a week for 2 years, which is a large request. After they refused, they were asked if they could take the delinquents to the zoo for a day, which is a small request. The second group were told the large request, but they were only asked to do the small request, while in the third group, they were only asked the small request. The results showed higher rates of compliance to the second request in the first group, where 50% agreed to do it, while 25% in the second group and 16% in the third group agreed to the second request. This demonstrates that compliance of a small request increases only if the person rejects the large request. The second experiment examined the impact of reciprocity concession on compliance when both requests are asked by different people. In the first and third group, they remained the same as the first experiment. However, in the second group, they had the large and small requests asked by 2 different experimenters. The results showed highest compliance for the small request in the first group, with 55%, and the third group saw 31% compliance. However, in the second group, with the 2 experimenters, only 10.5% agreed to the small request. This demonstrates that reciprocity concession does not apply when a person asks a small request. In the third experiment, they examined the effects of reciprocity when asking 2 equivalent requests. Both group 1 and 3 remained the same. However, in group 2, the experimenter asked 2 equivalent requests. So they would ask first if they could take the delinquents to the museum for a couple of hours, then ask if they could take the delinquents to the zoo for a couple of hours. Again, the results showed compliance highest in the first group with 54.1%. However, in both groups 2 and 3, they saw 33% compliance to the small request. This demonstrates the size of the request is relevant to compliance, and that the second request must be smaller in comparison to the first request. One of the strengths of the study is that the subjects were randomly selected, which increases internal validity. Another strength is that the study was conducted in multiple experiments to demonstrate the different aspects of the door-in-the-face technique. The first experiment indicated the rejection of the large request was important for compliance to the small request. The second experiment indicates the impact of reciprocity concession. The third experiment demonstrates that the size of the request is important as well. They also acknowledge that social norms may also impact how one reacts to this technique. A limitation of the study is that the sample size in each experiment, which decreases the external validity. Another limitation is that in the second experiment, all 58 subjects that were used were male, which could have resulted in a gender bias. However, in the other experiments, both sexes were used. Also, the study was not on university students, which makes one question if you could apply it to the lay population. Both techniques of the foot in the door and the door in the face are important concepts, since it allows for one to be more aware of these techniques when they're being used on them, which can help them critically assess the situation before making a decision. But how effective is one technique over the other? Well, that will be the next focus of this video.
Radfinos and colleagues conducted an experiment to examine the effectiveness of both the door in the face and the face in the door techniques in terms of compliance. They randomly assigned 99 undergraduate students into the 3 experimental conditions. The first group was subjected to the foot in the door technique, where the students were phoned and asked a small request to fill out 2 short questions about racism, and then later asked a moderate request of attending an hour-long seminar on racism. The second group was subjected to the door in the face technique, where they were asked a large request of attending an hour-long seminar about racism, and then asked a moderate request. The third group was only asked a moderate request, and were the control group of the study. The results found that the door in the face technique was most effective compared to the foot in the door and the control group. Also, the effects of the foot in the door technique was similar to that of the control. One of the merits of the study was that they acknowledged the findings in the literature contradicted each other. They also identified possible confounding factors that may influence the effectiveness of these techniques, such as the nature and the size of the request, and the delay between the requests. They also tried to increase the internal validity of the study by randomly assigning their subjects to the groups, making their study more reliable. However, they did find that a possible limitation in their study was the choice of the initial request for the foot in the door condition. They explained that people who answered the 2 questions on the racism survey will not necessarily attempt to make their behavior consistent by attending the seminar on discrimination. Another possible limitation was the small number of participants and the group used in the experiment. The subjects in the experiment are all students and would be more willing to sit through an hour-long seminar. However, the results may differ with other cohorts. Therefore, it would be difficult to generalize the results to the general population. This study produces more opportunities to do further research on attitude-behavior consistency with regards to compliance, the effectiveness of these techniques on different cohort groups, and identifying certain factors that influences a person's compliance. Future studies could be useful in marketing and awareness campaigns. The effectiveness of persuading people to comply with the target request may differ depending on the situation. We believe that the foot in the door method may be generally effective in situations where the requester is a friend, since most people would be willing to tolerate a friend's gradual increase in their demands compared to a random stranger. It could be due to our self-perception as being a person who would go out of their way for a friend. However, the door in the face technique may be more effective when done by strangers due to our concern with how we present ourselves in front of those we don't know. This is why the foot in the door technique may not be as effective when done by friends, because we may not feel as pressured to appear in a more self-enhancing way as with strangers. As not to come off as rude or insensitive, we feel obligated to accept the smaller request since the person was willing to compromise the larger request. Cultural factors may also play a role in influencing compliance. According to Petrova and colleagues, compliance towards consistency-based requests are more prominent in individualistic cultures compared to collectivist cultures. With this, we can see that foot in the door technique will be more effective in individualistic cultures than in collectivist cultures, since it relies on consistency. We believe that this could be due to the fact that individualistic cultures value and strive for self-consistency, as explained by Sanderson and Safdar. They would want their behaviors and attitudes to be more consistent with their self-image, so they're more likely to agree to the later request. However, with collectivist cultures, they view themselves in terms of social roles, so they're more tolerant of attitude, behavior, inconsistencies. Therefore, they'd be less likely to be influenced by consistency-based techniques. The door in the face technique relies on reciprocity to generate compliance. Reciprocity also plays a role in culture as a universal foundation. However, it's expressed differently in individualistic and collectivist cultures. According to Lecat and Crano, cultures that stress the importance of group cohesion and cooperative behaviors tend to heavily depend on enforcing normative values, such as reciprocity. Since collectivist cultures tend to focus on such values, we believe that they're more likely to comply with the door in the face technique. It relies on the consequences associated with rejecting the norm, such as guilt, to prompt individuals to accept the second request. However, individualistic cultures that do not heavily emphasize the importance of following the norms of society are less likely to be influenced by the door-in-the-face technique. To recap, this video explained the foot in the door and the door-in-the-face techniques that are used to get people to comply with a request. The foot in the door technique relies on consistency to induce compliance by asking a small request followed by a larger request. The door-in-the-face technique uses reciprocity to generate compliance by asking a large request followed by a smaller request. Current research has found mixed results regarding which is the best in causing compliance. There are other factors that influence compliance of the individual, such as self-perception and culture. Both these techniques are used in everyday life by people to get others to comply. The important thing is to be aware of when they're used and the motivation behind it. If you're interested in reading more about these techniques, the references are available below in the description box below. Now, next time someone tries to sell you something, or makes you feel like you owe them a request, you can look them in the face and smile and say, "Sorry, I'm not letting your foot in my door, and I didn't slam the door in your face or your request. I just gently closed it, so I don't feel guilty at all."
Created using Powtoon.